Welcome everyone to the January Technical Subcommittee meeting. My name is Nancy Larson, and Mark Stoddard has asked me to kick this meeting off with an introduction of our esteemed speaker today. Jean Waters is right now a business sustainability consultant working with small to medium-sized businesses on sustainable business processes, strategies, to analyze their triple bottom line, balancing impacts on people, profit, and planet. Jean is also working as a consultant with various agencies because in her tenure, she actually started, the time I first met her is Jean hired Barb Good and myself back in 2000. That's when Jean was the director of the K-State Pollution Prevention Institute. And then she moved to Nebraska, and she served the Pollution Prevention Resource Exchange for many, many years, working with Rick Yoder there at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And then most recently, she was Deputy State Director for the Nebraska Business Development Center, the NBDC, where she supervised and worked with NBDC consultants and Small Business Development Center, Procurement Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC, as well as Pollution Prevention Regional Information Center, P2RIC, and Technology Commercialization Program and Export Program. So Jean has a diverse business and pollution prevention, as well as compliance assistance background. Jean is a chemical engineer. I believe she has her master's in chemical engineering as well. And she has, she first did this presentation for us, or a version of it, and introduced us to Ricci a few years ago, and then recently spoke at our state conference, and then our pollution prevention roundtable. And every time I hear her do this presentation, I learn a little bit more, and it is fascinating. I've been able to take some of the information she's put together and present it to some of our industries, and they've been very, very interested in it. So I'm sure you will enjoy this presentation, and with that, I'll toss it to you, Jean. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And I'm really glad to be here and to be able to talk to everybody about this tool that EPA has developed, the Risk Screening Environmental Indicator Tool. And I appreciate the work that all of you are doing, working with small businesses and helping them to understand what they're doing and how they can do things a little bit differently and make improvements. And it takes a lot of people working in this area to help move the needle down. So with that, I'll start. Today, I want to remind you all of what the toxics release inventory is. That's the basis, that data is the basis for this risk screening environmental indicator tool. So we need to back up just a little bit and be reminded of that. And then I'm going to talk to you about Resi and how you can use it to help you prioritize and outreach projects that you might want to do, or facilities within a corporate parent. And then I want to talk to you a little bit, since I've always been pollution prevention person, and I think everyone understands that sometimes that can be a very effective way for people to be in compliance, is to just prevent the pollution in the first place. You don't have to deal with it. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the pollution prevention data that is available through TRI. So toxics release inventory was created in response to events that raised public concern about local preparedness. There was an incident in Bhopal, India, with the Union Carbide plant. Several hundred people, more than 1,000 people, were killed immediately from a release at that plant. and then many more were, affected by that, hurt by the release from the Union Carbide plant. And that was a very bad disaster, but then there was a similar release from a Union Carbide plant in West Virginia in 1984. And so that was what really helped people understand that we don't know what's going on in the chemical industry that we have in our midst, and we wouldn't know how to respond. If there's a chemical emergency, we don't, we don't know. The public doesn't know. The health protection agencies don't know. So the Toxics Release Inventory was created as part of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in 1986. Now, facilities that report under TRI have to meet certain thresholds. And so small businesses, typically small businesses don't report, but I think it's still useful to look at this information, and we can make some inferences from the TRI information to be able to help the small businesses as well. So that's just a little reminder on this slide. They have the ability to add chemicals to TRI. They added a whole bunch with the Pollution Prevention Act in 1990. And so currently it's 595 chemicals and 33 chemical categories that have to report. And the big incentive for TRI is that this information is public, and that becomes a motivating factor for facilities. So this graph shows you kind of some background. I hope you can all see my cursor as I move it around. So this is millions of pounds released from 2007 to 2017. The light blue down here along the bottom, these are air releases, on-site air releases, and you can see that that's reduced a little bit in the last 10 years. This darker blue is on-site surface water releases, and that's reduced maybe a little bit. The green is on-site land disposal, and as you can see, that's the biggest category here. And then the orange is off-site disposal or other releases. And so here's thousands of facilities. We have more facilities in 2017, which is the last year that we have data currently in TRI. They should be getting the 2018 data in there fairly soon, I would think. So that number fluctuates a little bit. And then this, this is the pounds released, and then these black dots, these are the number of facilities. So you can see there's a few less facilities than there were 10 years ago. Now here's a chart that shows you the risk, the Ricci numbers. This chart is showing modeled pounds. So if we look at the amount of toxins released or processed, otherwise used, whatever's being modeled in Ricci, which would be releases, this gives you an idea. Texas has the most material that's being released in pounds. Texas has the most. But you can see Louisiana, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Georgia, all of these states that are darker have more amount of material that's being released. So that gives you an overall picture of the United States. But then the question is, what does this mean to our health? So we can see that these releases are happening, but are all these chemicals equally dangerous? How does this release or disposal method affect exposure to people? where are the people in comparison to these releases? How many people are being exposed? So these questions is what the Ricci tool is trying to answer, the risk screening environmental indicators. So this is just a graphic to show they're looking at releases, what chemicals are released, what's the fate in the environment, how does it move through air, water, or land? How does exposure occur to people? Is that through inhalation, ingestion, absorption? And then what's the chemical's toxicity? And what's the risk of adverse effect? Now, at the end of this, so they use this algorithm to look at all of this information about all these chemicals that are being released from all these facilities. And at the end of that, you get a number. It's a Ricci score. This score is a unitless number. It provides you a relative indication of the risk to human health based on these factors right here. The size of the release, the fate, the transport, the chemical through the environment, and the size and location of the exposed toxicity and the chemical's toxicity. So that's what Ricci is going to do. It's going to give you a number that gives you a comparison of the risk from all these facilities. So now if we start looking at this over the last 10 years, this is the hazard, the Ricci hazard model, and the corresponding releases. And so as you can see here, air is by far the biggest method of release that results in hazard. So people are more exposed to air releases, basically, is what you're learning here. So then if we look at the score, the resultant score, so not the hazard of the chemical, but this is the resultant score. And in the Ricci tool, you can look at hazard, you can look at modeled pounds, or you can look at score. But I think for the purposes of the rest of this presentation, we're going to pretty much just look at these scores. So you can see that the scores in 2007 are higher than the scores in 2017. So that's a good thing. And also the millions of pounds released have correspondingly reduced. And these are releases that would be modeled under Ricci. So when we, when they do these land releases, nobody's exposed to that. That doesn't get modeled under Ricci. So that's the difference between that early chart that I showed that had the big blocks of land releases and this chart, which is showing you that air releases are really what contribute primarily to the Ricci score. And I know that all of you that are providing technical assistance under this program are concerned with the air program as well. So now if we look at the Ricci scores, this chart is a little bit different than the modeled pounds. So Texas has still got the highest score, but you can see now Illinois has a much higher score than they did before. Pennsylvania and Louisiana are both very high too. California. So here, this just gives you an indication of the Ricci score. So for the purposes of this, I decided to pick on Indiana. And so first of all, we're looking at Region 5. And these purple squares are facilities, and the darker the purple, the higher the Ricci score. And you can blow this up, to get more detail. You can download a spreadsheet of all these facilities and their scores. But for the purposes of illustration here, we've just got this map. And you can see that we've got a lot of facilities with a relatively high Ricci score. So now let's just look at Indiana. And it's probably kind of how you would expect around the cities. You've got more facilities and higher scores. And this is just for the last 3 years of data, 2015 through 2017. So now, how are we going to use this information to prioritize outreach? Well, on the Easy Ricci dashboard, you can get a whole bunch of information. And one of the things you can get is the top chemicals by TRI pounds and the Ricci score for air releases. So here, if you look for air releases, the TRI pounds by chemical, and you can see that there's a lot of sulfuric acid. This is for Indiana. There's a lot of sulfuric acid, styrene, hydrochloric acid, all of these different chemical releases. And when you're looking at pounds of chemicals released, this is the kind of pie chart that you get. But if we're interested to see what the risks are, we look at the Resi score by chemical, and you can see it's quite different. The chromium and chromium compounds account for the almost the 47%, not quite half, of the Resi score. And cobalt compounds are big, nickel, and then ethylene oxide, which isn't even over here, and neither is the chromium or the cobalt. And then it gets into other chemicals. Benzene is probably on both, although I don't see it called out here. But you can download these this data as an Excel spreadsheet so that you would have all this information and be able to see the different facilities, their Ricci score, and how that's contributing to the overall Ricci score of the state. So I have another slide later that talks more about limitations, but right now I want to say Ricci is a screening tool. So the results indicate priority, but you may have to investigate further. It gives you a good place to start, but it's not a full-blown risk assessment. In the case of metals, they are modeling these so that metals and metal compounds are assumed to have the same toxicity weight. So there may be a little bit of an overemphasis in the metals. It's a conservative model, so it may be projecting a little bit higher score than you might think. However, it is showing that they are only modeling this if the facilities are reporting these chromium air emissions. So there is, even though it seems like, I'm going to try to go back here one slide. Even though it seems like, this is a lot of risk based on chromium, and we'll find out that a lot of this is just metal finishing, not metal finishing, but manufacturing kinds of operations, people that are using maybe stainless steel or chromium containing steel in their operations. So how much of that is air emissions? Probably not all that much, but you have so many of these kinds of facilities, and they are reporting air emissions through cutting or welding or processing of these stainless steel materials. So what this is really telling you is that air emissions of chromium provide greater risk than you may be aware of. So here's the scores. You can download these things, like I said. So here's the scores by chemical for Indiana from 2015 to 2017. You can do this for any state. There's filters on this Ricci dashboard. You can do it for several counties. You can pick the years you want. So it's a powerful tool to get you some data. Anyway, you can see that the Ricci scores for chromium and chromium compounds are quite a bit higher than cobalt, than nickel, ethylene oxide, arsenic, cadmium, and then here's trichloroethylene, which is one we all know about and understand the risks of. But yet, compared to these others, trichloroethylene is down here a ways. So this is just something for you to think about when you're targeting your outreach. Is you need to be sure that you're considering the outreach of the impact of these metal releases. So here's a different pie chart you can get from that Easy Ricci dashboard. This one is telling you by industry sector which industry sectors are contributing the most to Ricci Score. So you can see here that primary metals are the biggest contributor. Hazardous waste, operators, transportation equipment, chemical manufacturers, fabricated metals, miscellaneous manufacturing. So that gives you an idea, if you wanted to target by industry sector, what you might consider doing. And it's reasonable to think that smaller facilities within the same industry sector would have similar orders of magnitude relative risk to each other. So let's look at the region around Indianapolis. And so here's a chart that is generated, and it shows you all of these facilities. And you can, again, you can download these. You can, when you're doing the tool live, which the tool does take a little bit of time. When you put in your search criteria, you have to give it a little bit of time to provide back the data. But you can hover over these different facilities and it'll tell you what facility it is and so forth. So here's what we find in Indianapolis. So, you know, when we looked in all of Indiana, the chemical sector was the 4th highest, but in the Indianapolis area, chemical sector is contributing more to the Ricci score than the fabricated metal. So if you're just doing so that's another thing to help you realize what kinds of industry is in the area that you're trying to target. If you're targeting the whole state, that's one thing. If you're targeting a smaller area or a municipality, that's another thing. So as you have clients in different places, you know, you can help them see what's going on in their locality. So this is just giving you some of that kind of information. So here's the industry sectors and their contribution to the Ricci scores, and then these are the chemicals that are contributing to the Ricci score. So this graph is a little bit harder to see, but in this one, the reason I wanted to show you this is that the light green bar is the mass of the release. The dark green bar is the Ricci score. So you can see that some of these, like this metal span facility, if you just looked at their TRI releases, it's not as much as their Ricci score. So their Ricci score shows that even though their releases are lower, their risk to their employees and the community around them is a little bit higher than you would expect just looking at their TRI releases. Here's another one, Elliott Company, same thing. A couple more, Phoenix Fabricators and Erectors, Prax Air Service Technologies. In both these cases, their Ricci score is higher than you might expect looking at their TRI. And then I wanted to point out this is a logarithmic scale. So, you know, these numbers, you know, this is quite a bit higher than this, for example. So again, just trying to show you that you can use the Ricci information to provide you a different way to look at data than you might have done in the past. So I was lucky that Mark shared with me a real world example. Indiana wants to offer pollution prevention assistance to 15 companies. So they downloaded the list of companies and the scores from the Easy Ricci dashboard. They downloaded that spreadsheet. There's a lot of companies on this, so it's kind of overwhelming. So now what are you going to do? Well, they decided to reduce some of the spreadsheet a little bit by eliminating all the electric utilities from the list. And then you can eliminate all facilities with a Ricci score less than some number. For this case, we picked 1,000, but you can look and see what your Ricci scores are for your state and make some decision about that and eliminate all the facilities with a score less than that. And then in this case, we sorted it by chemical, and then within each chemical sorted it by Ricci Score, so that we could find opportunities to see if there were industries within those industry sectors that looked somewhat different than some of the others. So the first one I'm going to show you here, this is a spreadsheet, and Indiana identified in yellow some of the facilities that they might be interested in. And then I identified in a light green some additional facilities for them to consider. So, for example, in this case, this is food manufacturing. I think it's wet corn milling. The acetaldehyde score was pretty high for these two facilities compared to the score for this one. So there may be an opportunity here, and we can talk more about that later. One of the things we can also do is look and see how do these scores compare to other wet milling facilities nationwide. But so you know, you get this data, you start to take a look at it. This gives you a good place to start, and then you have to do a little more investigation. These light green ones here, these are all ethanol plants. So the 3-digit NAICS code, you know, chemicals, but these all happen to be ethanol plants. So if you go to the 6-digit NAICS code, you can get more information. And then you see there's some other ethanol plants below that. And you can see these 3 scores are quite a bit higher than these. Is that because they're older facilities, they're bigger, you know, have more production, they're closer to population, so their releases are providing higher risk? You know, we don't know, but these are things that we should look at. Here's another one, kind of a high score for arsenic, so it's one that you might want to look at further. Here's another further down the line, diisocyanates. This one, plastics and rubber. These are plastics and rubber. And then when you go into the 6-digit NAICS code, these are 2 different, this one and these 3 right here are 2 different 6-digit NAICS codes. So those are things to look at further. So that's kind of what we're doing here. We're looking at these chemicals. We're looking at the facilities within the chemicals. We're trying to think of, would these potentially be facilities we should look at further based on these Ricci scores? So to conclude on that example, Ricci is a good place to begin. It's a good place to look when you're trying to identify facilities or sectors to provide outreach. It highlights these risks, which are not necessarily identified when you're just looking at the mass of the toxics released under TRI. Further investigation is warranted after identifying facilities, and many factors are involved to reduce the toxics use. High Ricci scores may be used to help you motivate those facilities to action. And one of the things that Mark commented on in this example was another thing to think about when you're looking at outreach is, you know, would these facilities that you might target be interested in cooperating with you and participating in a pollution prevention project? So that is another good thing to think about when you're targeting your outreach. So again, this is a tool that you can add to your tool belt. It's not the only tool. Here's something that I think can be useful if you are working with a company and they're part of an overall parent facility. You might be able to help them use their Ricci score to get funding from the parent facility to do a project. So here's an example. These are Owens Corning facilities, insulation plants. Here's the Ricci score for the Kansas City, Kansas facility. And as you can see, the Wabash, Indiana facility is quite a bit higher. This one in Illinois is higher. The Fort Smith, Arkansas, Duncan, South Carolina is higher. Waxahachie, Texas, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right, is higher. And Newark, Ohio is higher. So why is that? You know, I don't know. But if you're in South Carolina and you're working with this facility right here, you know, you might be able to ask them that question. Why is your Ricci score higher than this one in Kansas City? I know this one in Kansas City is located in a highly populated area, so that's probably not the reason. Maybe it's operating under different equipment. Maybe it's doing something slightly different in its process, but it's certainly worth a question. And then as facilities are able to ask corporation headquarters for money for projects, they might be able to use that to help them get some resources to do a project. This example is the Green Plains ethanol. Here's the one in Iowa. Here's one in Indiana. Here's another one in Indiana, which has a higher score. This is probably the one we were looking at from that spreadsheet. Here's one in Illinois, has an even higher score. So what's going on in these facilities? Why do they have different scores on the Ricci? I don't know, but that might be something that we could investigate with a facility that we would work with. We looked at Tyson meat processing facilities, and we did this partly because we found this Tyson meat processing facility in Emporia, Kansas, had this really high Ricci score compared to the facilities in other states. And after we investigated this, what we found was this facility in Emporia, during the time period we were looking at, 2015 through 17, did a bunch of process changes, and they got rid of a bunch of stainless steel equipment that was at their facility because they were changing the way they were doing their process. However, they reported emissions, they reported chromium emissions. So I'm not sure what they were doing in their facility at that time to have these emissions, whether they were cutting up the stainless, you know, what they were doing with it that was resulting in the emissions. But they did report air emissions, and so that's why they have a high Ricci score. At this point in time, their 2018 TRI report, they did not report any chromium air emissions. But this was an interesting finding, and it was interesting to investigate that further and find out what was going on. So again, here's another slide to talk about the limitations of Ricci. The geographic dispersion models only extend about 30 miles. One limitation is if facilities provide incorrect or imprecise data, because the Ricci scores are based on TRI data, which are provided by the facilities. These scores are modeled using a single emission point and a standard stack height. So all those things are there to be considered when you're using Ricci. It's still a good tool, but you know, I just want you to know that it does have limitations. So then I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about pollution prevention information. And I'm probably everybody's familiar with EnviroFacts. You can, from EnviroFacts, you can do TRI searches. And from that, you can get the pollution prevention searches. And so I just wanted to show this screen, and from EnviroFacts, you can do there's a lot of different ways you can search for things here, and this is how you can drill down and get access to a facility's TRI reports. So we're going to talk about pollution prevention because they have the ability to report pollution prevention activities at their facility. And in 2017, 1,500 facilities reported some pollution prevention activities. That's only 7% of all facilities, but it's still helpful to see what people are reporting that they're doing to reduce the amount of toxics that they're releasing. And you can see that good operating practices nationwide that's the category that people report most often, is helping them, is good operating practices, and then process modifications, spill and leak prevention, inventory control, which I think sometimes is underrated but can be very important, raw material modifications. This one is the one that a lot of pollution prevention people like to work on, because if you can get people to change from a toxic solvent to a non-toxic solvent, for example, you know, that's an awesome thing to do. And you just get rid of the pollution load, and you know, you're able to not have to comply with those regulations anymore because you just don't have that stuff on site anymore. But it's hard to do that. Product modifications are the same thing. Cleaning, changes in cleaning and degreasing, and surface prep and finishing, which I think also is an underrated opportunity. One of the things that you can get from the TRI reporting are these Ricci Score comparison reports. And these are pretty cool. So you can get that for a specific facility that you might be looking at helping. So this blue bar on all of these, this is the score, the Ricci score for that facility. The red bar, the shorter red bar here, this is the median score for the industry. So like when we're looking at ethanol plants or whatever, you could go into that ethanol plant, you could look at this comparison, and you could see how does that facility score compare to the industry median. Then here's this gold bar is the county median, for score. The green is the state median, and the purple is the US median. So what you can see is that this facility had a pretty high score until they enacted some pollution prevention. This was a facility that I think was, they reduced their chrome emissions. It was a facility that was making seating, like office chairs. They changed their process and got rid of their chrome process, and they eliminated their Ricci score, or it's very low, not showing up here. So they did some process changes and were able to really reduce their risk to their employees in the community by making some process changes. In any case, this kind of comparison is available for all these facilities, so you can look at this and see what's happening for the facility that you're interested in working with. Another thing you can do is you can do a P2 search by chemical and by NAICS code. So I did that for this. This was the plastic sheeting people. They had formaldehyde, was one of the chemicals that they had. You can see the Wilson Art. These are both Wilson Art entries. They reduced their formaldehyde, and I think that they did that by changing their fuel oil consumption in the boilers. So that's what they did. They have these codes that they put in on the TRI, source reduction, and then they have these different opportunities. And then so you can get information. That was that first, when we looked at this first chart right here, these are all codes. These all have different codes. And so they're saying that of all the facilities that are reporting, this many are reporting good operating practices, for example. So, but you can get that detail as you look through the pollution prevention searching. Here's another one of those. This is diisocyanates and the 6-digit NAICS code. So this was for laminated plastics, plate and sheet, except packaging, and shape manufacturing. And so that was one of the ones in Indiana that had identified some of the facilities had this 6-digit NAICS code. So we wanted to go in and see what are other people doing to reduce diisocyanates. And so they're using urethane, and they were able to substitute some raw material there. And they say in their comments that they're continuing with their research to find alternative to urethanes. So these are all, again, these are all the same Dow Chemical Company. But you can go in and look at that, and you can see the different years and what they're doing to reduce their emissions. Here's the ethanol plants, acetaldehyde. How are they reducing their emissions of acetaldehyde? Process modifications. And this one was treatment. So sometimes, even though it's listed as a pollution prevention practice, it's actually treatment. You'll see that a lot. I think people don't always understand the definition of pollution prevention. I mean, because they're doing this on site, and so they probably feel like they're preventing the pollution from leaving their facility because they're increasing their thermal oxidizer to control these emissions. And so that is a disconnect between what industry sometimes thinks about the definition of pollution prevention and the way we would think about it as being something that's within the process. But anyway, anyway, it's interesting to look at this and see if you can get any ideas as you go forward to try to help the facility that you're working with. So to conclude, Ricci does provide you some valuable context for the TRI because it's giving you a relative measure of potential risk. So you can use the Ricci scores to help you prioritize action to a facility. It's not an absolute value of risk, but it is a good screening tool. And then for a facility, Ricci reports can be useful. You know, this is all public information. Somebody could ask a facility about it if they would, you know, see this information. So those facilities that you might work with that are TRI facilities, it'd be helpful for them to understand that they have these Ricci scores if they're not aware of it, and what it means, and how they might be able to use that to help them get resources to make some changes. And that is the website. Usually if you just put easy Ricci in your Google search engine, it will help you get there. And but those are the website addresses if you want to go directly to those dashboards. Mark, are there any questions?
I didn't get any chat questions, but I am curious with the metals. Is there a way of drilling down and figuring out the state of the metals, whether we're talking about particulates or some type of volatile compound, or if it's a byproduct of combustion?
Yeah, you could do that if you look at their TRI report.
Okay.
And in those, if you go to EnviroFacts and you look on the TRI report, and this, I don't actually have a, yeah, I don't have a screenshot of it really, but when you go onto this, I'm sorry I don't have a screenshot of that, but this P2 details button is one that that will show you those graphs that I had shown. But you'll get these graphs right here are what you get from the P2 details button, I believe. But you'll end up with this kind of facility information, except that it will have the Form R. A bunch of these things will be things you can click on and get more information.
Oh, okay.
This is a level below that because I was doing P2 searches. So before you get to this P2 search level, when you're in EnviroFacts up here, you can do searches up here, and the screen looks a little different. You might, you put in company name, like containing the word Green Plains, if I wanted to do Green Plains Energy. And then I could put in Indiana or not, and it would return to me a list of all the Green Plains facilities. And then within that list of the facilities, I can click on the TRI reports. And then I can go into the TRI reports and get all of that level of detail that you're asking about.
Oh, okay.
There's also these, you can do searches over here. So there's several different ways to get to it.
Do you have any? So does any other state have any questions? I mean, now would be an excellent time to ask.
Hi, Jean. This is Belinda.
Hi.
And I just wanted to say thank you for this presentation. I didn't realize how much data we could pull out from there. So I'm looking forward to going in and searching on my state.
Yes, I think that's good, Belinda. Thanks for your comment. And I don't know how many people know about Ricci. I mean, it's, and you know what, EPA is doing a lot of interesting things with data lately. They're doing a lot to try to help the local emergency planning committees know more. They've got some really interesting information on floodplains, and so I feel like EPA is really starting to provide some really great tools. I suppose it's partly because of the ability of all this mapping and stuff that's available nowadays. I just feel like there's a lot that we can learn from some of this data that for a long time we had the data, but we didn't have the level of information that we do now. And I appreciate that EPA is developing this data to be useful for us who are trying to provide assistance on the ground, because it is very helpful.
Anything regarding your selection process?
I'm
So
sorry.
I want to, oh, go ahead.
Did somebody else have a question?
Oh, I thought someone else was asking. So this is Mark Stoddard with Indiana. I also want to thank you for your willingness to share your wealth of knowledge with our group. I wish I could think of some more questions to ask you without sounding silly or idiotic.
Oh, no. You know what? When I gave this presentation at the Kansas Environmental Conference, wasn't exactly this presentation, but just showing Ricci. And for that meeting, I showed where some of the facilities were, kind of like that one in Indiana, except like in Indianapolis, except I identified all those facilities and listed their scores and whatnot. And, you know, it piqued people's interest, in some of the industries who were present at that meeting. You know, they had follow-up questions, and they wanted to see, you know, how they compared nationwide. And so some of that, if you give a presentation, if you have the opportunity to present this information to some of the facilities in your state, you might get some questions. And it's not hard to drill down through this tool and to get some of those answers for people. And you know, they appreciate knowing this information because it's public, and you know, they're not experts on looking at this stuff themselves. So it's nice for you to provide that service.
Yeah, I think there is a tendency of becoming insulated to where you don't know what's going outside your own four walls.
Sure.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
It's Jennifer Dixon from Michigan. And I just wanted to say that I'm listening to the webinar and it's awesome. And now, of course, I'm on the webpage trying to figure out what I'm looking at, which I think is like maybe the hardest thing. And looking up a specific facility that we've had issues with a release recently of TCE, and just trying to kind of look at, you know, what actually the Ricci numbers are and what do they mean. So thank you for doing this. It's definitely been really super helpful. It would be nice if it was like really current data instead of 2017. I know you don't have control of that, but interestingly, the concerns here from the community are TCE, but they're also chrome plater, which of course, as you said earlier, a lot of times that value is higher for chrome than it would be for TCE in these same facilities. So just interesting to note. So thank you for kind of going through all of that. I think this is going to help me kind of dig deeper.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're able to do that. And if, you know, one of the things I didn't do on this is like tell people exactly how to drill down on the tool. And I think my notes on this will at least give you a pathway on how I got all these charts. But if you ever have a question, I'm happy to help you with that. Or I know there's also EPA people that can help with that. And they have a contractor who does the tool. The contractor, I've asked the contractor some questions and they're very helpful. So anyway, it's good to know that the information is out there. I'm glad that you'll be able to use it because it will help, I think, in your communities for people to know this kind of thing.
Gene, I know we have the recording, but could we possibly have a copy of the presentation as well?
Yes, and I thought I sent that to you, Mark, but I'll definitely do that right after we get off.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
You know, regarding PERC or TCE, I find sometimes when it comes into a community, as in it's found in someone's drinking water community well, people get very excited about that, and now there are a lot of interested parties in trying to replace their PERC or their TCE with something else.
Well, and that, you know, and I think that's great. I mean, I'm not trying to say don't look at PERC, you know, at all. I think it's important to look at it. And right now it seems like drinking water, people are aware of the risks in drinking water. And really the Ricci thing doesn't cover really much on drinking water. I mean, it does model if there's a water release, it models how that goes downstream. But that's different than the way PERC usually gets into water through the ground. From a
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a latent exposure.
Right. And you know, whatever people are concerned about, I think it's important to respond to that and to have as much information as we can. And anything that motivates people to think about replacing a chemical with something that's less toxic, changing their process so that they don't need as much of that, you know, any of those strategies are important and, you know, useful. So if it's drinking water that they're thinking about, I think that's awesome. That's a good way to get people to move.
Right. Well, I think a lot of the dry cleaners have kind of made a move from using PERC to an alternative solvent. And actually, we have a gentleman with the Dry Cleaning and Laundry Institute, John Meyer, will be talking next month about the current state of dry cleaning and dry cleaning solvents. I believe there was some question about whether dry cleaners use, I think it was propyl bromide, but I might be confused. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can close.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the best, and thank you for the work you do.
And thank you, Jean.
Mm-hmm.
Have a good day.
Thank you.